And that is a great segue into discussing some of these issues around negotiations, Ukraine, the politics of the U.S. Congress. And for this discussion, we are very honored to be joined by Medea Benjamin, who is a co-founder of Code Pink and author of the recently released War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict. Medea, thank you so much for being back with us.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Eugene and Rania. I can almost feel like a sigh of relief just being on with you as opposed to other shows I've been on in the last 2 days.
Yeah, I can only imagine. And I know you've been on a tour too of the country as well, talking about this with all sorts of different people. And I guess I'm just curious, Medea, to start what you're making of the fact that the sort of first glimmer of progressive opposition to the war in Ukraine and looking for peace talks was just kind of so quickly shut down in both the discourse and the political conversation.
I think we're living in crazy land here in the United States. I mean, I never thought I would be in a position to see how the call for diplomacy is treated as heresy, as treacherous, as giving in to Putin, as not supporting Ukraine. It's just amazing that they are so fearful of any dissent within the Democratic Party. And I probably shouldn't even use that word dissent, because that letter, if you read that letter, that was the mildest of letters. It started out with all kinds of praise for Biden, how great he's been, how Congress has been so supportive, giving military aid. And then it merely said, we should pair that with proactive diplomacy. That's all it said. And I am so naive that when that letter first came out, I thought, you're going to get every member of the Democratic Party to sign that. I knew it wouldn't be Republicans because of all the praise for Biden, but I thought, who's going to object to that? Boy, was I wrong.
Yeah, I mean, it's really stunning, right? Because the letters also expressed support for, like you mentioned, it praised the Biden administration's policy, expressed support for continuing to militarily support Ukraine. It just very lightly called for prioritizing some measure of diplomacy, particularly given the stakes with this war, in the sense that we're talking about potential for nuclear escalation, which, isn't being discussed enough. But then you had them retracted, right? Like first there was all this pressure and all this outrage against this letter, and then you had them retracted. And as a leader in Code Pink, Medea, you've been involved in many and in lobbying against many conflicts and trying to push for members of Congress. I'm sure you've probably worked with dealing with the Progressive Caucus before, when we're talking about places like Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, maybe parts of Latin America. So I'm curious, is this unprecedented? Like, were you surprised by this reaction? Is there a comparable conflict in which just the mere call for diplomacy provokes this level of intense pressure and outrage to the point where members of Congress are bullied into withdrawing it?
I've never seen anything like this before. I've never seen a letter signed by members of Congress that was signed, sealed, and delivered and then withdrawn. That's really unprecedented. And I think it speaks volumes to the political situation in our country right now, where everything is about partisan politics, where you can't trust anybody in what they're saying. You have these right-wing Republicans calling for a cutoff in money to Ukraine, but, would they be doing it if Trump were in the White House? I doubt it. And now you have these Democrats who tip their toe into a sane pond, calling for talks, when even the private conversations in the White House and the Pentagon are saying that there is no winning in Ukraine. And the whole of the Democratic establishment came down on them. We even saw members who signed the letter balking and saying, take my name off of that. I would have never signed. I signed back in the summer months when it looked like Ukraine wasn't doing so good, but now they're about to win, and so I wouldn't have signed it now. All kinds of things coming from conservative to progressive Democrats that I just find very, very dangerous at this moment.
One of the things that I'm wondering, just sort of your thoughts on sort of taking away from this is, I mean, how much does this speak to the power of, the sort of permanent military industrial war complex in these sorts of situations whereby it seems, everything is so centered around this drive to war, and no matter what you can do, no matter what people do, no matter what the situation is, it just seems like reality is just pushed to the side. I mean, it just feels like there has to be some force that is pushing here for this kind of lockstep reality without any sort of conversation.
Yes, I certainly think it shows the power of this military industrial congressional complex that is always looking for another war. And when we wound down the war in Afghanistan, well, lo and behold, there was Ukraine. And, while there are members of the right-wing Republican Party that are calling to stop the blank check to Ukraine, many of them are saying our real adversary is China.
Right.
So we have two war parties in the pockets of the weapons companies that make billions and billions of dollars from this conflict.
And then the other aspect of this that was quite disappointing was it didn't surprise me to see certain members of Congress immediately capitulate to this kind of pressure from these various forces that we're discussing, military, industrial complex, weapons companies. I'm sure there was lots of phone calls received, not to mention the sort of media firestorm that was created around this letter. But it was also striking to me to see how even the most progressive members of Congress, right, were very much against this letter and expressing outrage about their names being on this letter. And then you had, this made me really sad, you had Bernie Sanders come out and say he didn't support this letter. And to me, it just suggests, there's not even a single person in either Congress or the Senate, not even one person that's willing to put their name on the issue of diplomacy. I mean, what does that say about where we're at? It goes to what you're talking about, where we don't have any real representation in Congress. But I mean, even if you poll the American public, the majority of people, if I'm not mistaken, are actually for some sort of negotiation and diplomatic solution to this conflict. So what does it say when even the people who run as, oh, I'm on the left, I'm anti-war, who've even used the term anti-imperialism before, aren't even able to put, to use those words now with respect to this conflict? Does it speak to, because at the end of the day, I know these are just politicians, right? And there's nobody maybe in their base pushing them enough. But what does it say about the anti-war movement? What does it say about the left? What can we be doing to be pushing our members of Congress and be pushing this conversation in the direction it needs to go in?
Well, let's remember there are members of Congress, 57 Republicans in the House and 11 in the Senate, who did vote against the $40 billion. It was just that there was not one Democrat. And yes, it's been very sad to see that out of a progressive caucus of 100, they only got 30 to sign. And then those 30, one by one, were saying, take my name off. And that includes Jamie Raskin, Sarah Jacobs. It includes Ilhan Omar. And yes, Bernie Sanders, I went to his office and met with his aide, and they said, and I said, can't we get a similar letter like this in the Senate? And he looked at me and he said, that letter is tone deaf. You can't talk to Putin. And I think that is such an irrational position to hold. So what can we do? Yes, it speaks that we need a much stronger movement. There have been groups that have been meeting with their members of Congress, calling for precisely diplomacy and calling on them not to vote for an upcoming package of $50 billion that it looks like they're trying to ram through Congress in this lame duck session. And I've been going around the country with this new book on a 50-city speaking tour. And it's been fascinating because I've been meeting at these talks, not just people who self-identify as progressives, Democrats, to the left of the Democrats, socialists, but also people who are libertarians and even Trump supporters. So there is the possibility of a broad tent of people, especially as recession sets in. And people are going to be asking more and more, why are we giving over $100 billion to Ukraine when I can't pay my energy bills? when look at the price of food in the grocery store, and the price at the pump is going to be going up again. So I think we will see a lot more people questioning this and calling for talks.
Mm-hmm. And just a reminder to folks, that book is War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict, Medea Benjamin and Nick Davies from OR Books. And you know, I'm glad you brought up the story from Bernie Sanders' office, because I feel that is such a key element of this whole thing is the idea that negotiating with someone somehow implies some level of support. And I feel, you know, I've been dealing with anti-war issues in the first Iraq War. You know, you can't negotiate with Saddam. You can't negotiate with the Taliban. You can't negotiate with Putin. And it's always this sort of piece. And I wonder how you respond when people put that in front of you, because I think that is sort of a thing that scares a lot of people, because they think calling for negotiations means that they now have endorsed the entire program of Vladimir Putin.
I say that wars almost always end at the negotiating table, and that we have to try. That if you think that you can't negotiate, well, let us see what happens when negotiations are initiated. I talk about what happened at the end of March when Turkey was mediating talks, and there was a 15-point plan on the table, but that was scuttled not by Ukraine or Russia, but by the UK and the US deciding to move the goalpost and say it was no longer about ending the war, but about weakening Russia. And then I also say that there have been successful talks on particular things, like getting the international inspectors into the Zaporizhia nuclear plant, or getting the thousands of tons of grain from Ukraine out into countries that desperately need it, or the 17, by my calculation, prisoner swaps that have happened. So that shows that they can talk. It just means that there has to be talks not only between Ukraine and Russia, but there have to be talks between Russia and the United States. And Sergei Lavrov from Russia suggested that Putin and Biden could talk at the upcoming G20 meeting in Indonesia. And the Secretary of State Blinken just brushed that off as a sign of posturing. Well, I say we want you to call their bluff, if indeed you think it's a bluff, and start meeting.
You know, Medea, I think that what's, so disturbing about this particular conflict, not that other conflicts aren't disturbing, because with every war comes, atrocities and human suffering, in very extreme ways. But in this case, the stakes are so high because of the issue of potential nuclear escalation. And you have officials in Washington really very cavalierly talking about nuclear retaliation and escalation like it's no big deal. And so can you just talk about what's at stake here and why it's so important? Because I feel like it's really not emphasized enough. And in fact, when it is emphasized in the media, what we keep hearing is that, oh, well, if we actually sit down and negotiate with Putin, it actually makes nuclear war more likely, which is just completely illogical to me. So I don't know. What do you say about that?
Well, I think it's a good time to get people to reflect on what happened 60 years ago exactly, which was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that was a time when nuclear Armageddon was a possibility. And we had two leaders, JFK and Khrushchev, who decided that they would talk to each other, communicate. And not only was the stand down attributed to the fact that the U.S. agreed it wouldn't attack Cuba and Russia withdrew its missiles, but there was more compromise, which was that the U.S. withdrew its missiles from Turkey. And a year later, when JFK was reflecting on that, he said, never put a nuclear power into a position where they have to choose between a humiliating retreat and the use of nuclear weapons. And that's what Biden is doing right now. So it's extremely dangerous. And yes, when you hear pundits cavalierly say, oh, well, the probability of the use of a nuclear weapon is maybe only 10 or 20%. I say 1% is unacceptable. And that's why we need to do everything that we can to force the leaders of all countries to find a solution. And that's why leaders from all over the world, whether it's Indonesia or South Africa or India, are all saying, we don't want to take sides in this. There's only one side we want to take, and that's the side of peace. You all need to find a solution.
Well, I know Code Pink is working at the grassroots here in the U.S. to raise the voice for peace. So for people who are watching, Medea, how can they find your work and get engaged?
There's two ways. One is to go to our website, codepink.org, and the other is to go to the website called peaceinukraine.org, which is a coalition of groups around the country. We encourage you to join us because the only way we're going to see the Secretary of State meet with his counterpart in Russia or Putin meet with Biden is if we at the grassroots put more pressure on. And let's make sure we don't silence the voices, the very few voices in Congress who are calling for negotiations.
Well, once again, Medea Benjamin, author of War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict, among other things. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks so much. Good being with you.